Keep lines of communication open, keep trading, and change will come. For decades, that was the mantra in relations between Europe and China. But that softly approach is being replaced by a clash of political cultures. In the midst of the corona pandemic, Beijing has been snapping up floundering European companies, clamping down on democracy in Hong Kong, and imposing surveillance systems on its own citizens. Europe and China are apparently drifting further apart, while the US and Beijing fight out a bitter trade war. Here on To The Point, we ask, partner or rival, how dangerous is China? Well, thanks so very much for joining us here on To The Point, where my studio guests are political scientist Didi Kirsten Tatlow, who believes that China will do away with liberal democracy if the West allows it to. Also with us is journalist Felix Lee, who argues that Europe must be hard and firm in its dealings with the Chinese leadership, just like the Chinese themselves. And a warm welcome too to author Alexander Görlach, who says, as long as there are concentration camps in China, there can never be normal relations with that country. Thank you all three for those initial comments. Felix, I'd like to begin with you. It has not been a good week for already troubled relations between the EU and China. And one senior member of the European Parliament, a Green member of the Parliament, said those relations are now as bad as at any time in recent decades. Do you agree?
Well, the summit didn't show this because, it was a very short summit. It was only
a digital summit between the Europeans and the Chinese.
And China, and Merkel, as a president, came up, and also Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen. And it seemed like business as usual. But I must agree on that position. I'm not sure if it's a good sign, because there are a lot of topics which should have been talked about and should have negotiated much harder. And it seemed like this didn't happen. So it is a bad sign,
Okay.
I would say.
Didi, just an initial comment from you. Europe for a long time believed and hoped that if we kept talking to each other, then that would lead to peace and prosperity and more understanding. It hasn't happened that way at all, has it?
No, it hasn't, because the realities of power are much tougher than that, unfortunately. And I think the challenge of dealing with a communist party such as the Chinese one, which is really forged in huge amount of conflict and underground activity as well, are really almost, I don't want to say beyond the capacities of liberal democracies, but I think they certainly stretch our capacities to the very limit.
Alexander, let's bring you in. In the last year or two, the EU has gone over to describing China as a systemic rival. What does that mean?
Well, China has deployed its own ideas in international institutions, for instance, in the United Nations, where they propagate their own idea of human rights, which is basically one which is without any civic rights. It's mostly like social rights. You say, like, we give you something to eat and that you should be thankful for. So China has been undermining the liberal institutions, not trying to abolish them, but like to be like changing the rules of the game.
You're nodding, Kirsten. Just to give us an idea about, on top of all the things that you've talked about already, what role does the corona pandemic play in all this?
You know, COVID-19, wherever it came from in China, as it emerged there, really has obviously brought things into very sharp focus, and I think is being used as an opportunity by Beijing to bind Europe, or to try to bind Europe very closely to China along the lines of, here's a crisis, we must pull together, our interests are the same. And then the push-button points come, the talking points, health, who's going to argue against health? Cooperation, multilateralism. Who's going to argue against cooperation and multilateralism? You can't do that without seeming really kind of unpleasant and nasty. And, of course, this is what Donald Trump is in some ways doing. And look what the reaction is in Europe. But, again, the realities of the power realities behind these arguments coming out of Beijing are such that I think that we really need to question ourselves much more strongly about how we're reacting.
But for the Americans, meanwhile, Mike Pompeo has said there has been an awakening because of corona and because of China's aggression in trade
Absolutely.
and diplomacy.
Well, I think trust has plummeted. People are horrified, and no wonder. It's a cliche to say things are complicated, but they are quite complicated with China, I think. So we've got a lot of talking and working out to do going forward.
If the leitmotif for all this so far has been change through trade and that no longer applies, what is the new leitmotif? What is the new watchword for where we are now?
Well, I feel like at this point we have to sort out our general guidelines of policies with China, as in like the one China policy is obsolete because the People's Republic is threatening Taiwan, which is like not part of the One China deal. We have seen what happened in Hong Kong, which is also like a breaking on international contract, like international law. We see like the horrendous things that happen in Xinjiang, and now they're cracking down on Inner Mongolia. So literally, as we all are, I hope, agreeing that genocide is not an opinion, it's just literally, before we talk about trade and the modalities of trade, it's just literally to talk about what country do you want to be, China.
Yeah, and also economy has changed. The relationship also between Europe, especially Germany and China, has changed. And I sometimes doubt that people here in Germany, especially the government, if they have realized how much it has changed. I mean, China is not longer just a big, huge market where you can sell German machines, but China has become a rival on a lot of terms, and the difference is that behind Chinese companies there's always a strong communist party and a strong communist government, and sometimes I have the feeling that here people still think, okay, we're business, we're on the same level. We're not. They have a very powerful government behind it, and here a lot of German companies or European companies, they don't have that.
OK, let's just watch one short report, because there is one thing that's certain. There's massive mistrust between the EU and China. Certainly around Europe, there's a lot of concern, a lot of anger over what's been seen as bargain-hunting Chinese investors taking advantage of the corona pandemic to snap up struggling companies. Here's one example from Germany, then we'll talk further.
Kitchens made in Germany, such as those from Poggenpol, are among the best in the world. After 120 years of company history, the German kitchen manufacturer is now in Chinese hands. In order to secure Poggenpol's long-term survival at the Herford facility, it was necessary, over the last few months, to initiate the sales process. The pandemic was certainly a factor that moved us to expedite this process. China is investing billions around the world, but there is a fear that Chinese corporations are taking over companies on such a large scale for a very specific reason. The Chinese want to be global leaders in important emerging markets within a few years. To achieve this, they need foreign know-how, which they are buying with state support, and that is, of course, part of the distortion of the market, which is not okay. What can Europe do about this?
So there we are, we're talking about the economy again, and Kirsten Tatlow had something that she wanted to get to express very importantly now.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one looks at these stories about Poggenpol, for example, or Eon Med, which was another company that made medical ventilators that was bought by Chinese interests, I think, in March this year, in the height of the COVID-19 crisis in Europe. And you sort of ask yourself, you know, it's like these two value systems, as they are, the democratic one and this authoritarian one, to put it politely, I think, you know, I really have somehow thought that they were playing the same game, but they're not playing the same game. You know, the one side is playing tennis, the other side is playing badminton. Now, how's that going to work? You know, there are these, the fundamental agreements just aren't there about a lot of issues. And I think that, you know, we've thought for many years now, for decades now with China, that somehow, you know, capitalism would win the day and China would change. In fact, China is changing us. I see that all the time in the discourse, in the narrative about how things are here. And, you know, I think we really also need to question our assumptions that money somehow has morality embedded into it. I don't think money, i.e. trade or capitalism, necessarily has morality. I think it's about making money, and I think that it's the job of politics, politicians, civil society, and other people to insist on the right parameters within which relations and also trade can take place.
Alexander?
Yeah, but I also feel like our trade agreements now have a different nature as they used to have, like, let's say, 30 years ago. It's about environmental issues. It's about workers' rights. So these are all implemented now in trade agreements the European Union forges, and that is also puts you on clash with China. I remember in Colombia and Chile where they tried to build some infrastructure projects, and then the governments there said, well, then you employ our workers. And they said, no, we bring our own. And then, of course, then it's not a business model if you have to implement workers' rights and environmental issues. So then the Chinese didn't have a business case anymore. So I feel like we have the human rights violations big time, what I said before. But on top of that, also the nature of our trade agreements is different than it used to be 40 years ago.
Felix?
Yeah, to put things in place, I mean, Germany still is a much bigger investor in China than vice versa. So
a very important point.
Yes, it's not necessarily bad when Chinese companies invest in little German companies, help them, because a lot of these middle family companies, they have problems to find successors. And so it's not necessarily bad. The problem is when China is strategically investing with the help of the government in also strategic companies. Like I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about the 5G network, which is also very important. And I think this is a problem that the Europeans and especially Germany doesn't recognize that there is a strategy behind, and they just let this happen. This is a problem. So I think on this term, it's the German government or the Europeans who have to make their homework and put borders and say, okay, there are certain companies which are not for sale.
I think that's right. I mean, Europe has really been stupendously naive in many ways, I think. And part of that is the normative power of European values, self-belief, economic systems, the kind of capitalism that we have had in Europe and in the United States. We thought it had this kind of moral power to change other people. We put those terms into the trade agreements, you're quite right, and then it'll change everything. Well, no, because that's not what, other government or other systems want. They don't want those parts of the agreements, really, it seems to me. They will sign it to make the deal go, but they will then try and work against it. And my concern with China as well is that even if with this comprehensive agreement on investment, even if something is reached, which I'm highly sceptical about...
It's not going to happen this year, is it?
No. Also, anything that does happen is going to be tiny. It's going to be really small. And we saw a sign of that with the German wine and beer makers deal, etc.
Peanuts, right?
Absolutely, yeah, drinks, peanuts, right. So again, I think that... I think the whole trade thing is complex, etc., but we do need to sort of ask ourselves what we're doing and whether we haven't just convinced ourselves that we're completely right about a lot of stuff, which I think we are right about a lot of things, to be honest, especially on the human rights area, but whether or not that is actually going to be enough to deal with China.
The basic assumption is, and you alluded to that a few times now, is like once you have trade going on, it will also automatically somewhat open up societies and the discourse in societies. And that's actually true. Like in Hong Kong, when you were still allowed to do that, it was flourishing in democratic ways. Taiwan is a fully functioning democracy. So only if autocrats like Xi put pressure on these countries, use technological means, they can oppress this sort of democratic movement. But the basic assumption that we had in the free world, which is not only the West, but it's also Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, so it's extending over the whole globe. It's not just a Western fantasy or idea or hegemonia-like set of values. Wherever you can, you want democracy. And that's actually also the threat to Xi Jinping, that like in Hong Kong and Taiwan, people would just choose something different than his autocratic system, which he sells to the world as the inherent Chinese model of governance.
Mm-hmm. Our central question here on the show today, we haven't addressed it, I haven't put it yet, is China a partner or a rival? How do you see that in the context of what you've just been saying about these competing systems?
Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China has become an adversary of the rest of the world, and nowadays it's also like an enemy. So an
adversary and an enemy of the rest of the world.
Of the free world. Because like the idea is like to undermine all the global institutions. What happened with the World Health Organization conversation is horrendous.
Right.
And to exclude Taiwan from this entity is horrendous, and it's part of an ethnic sort of chauvinism/racism sort of idea that came into being through Xi Jinping's reign, where China was certainly not a free country before, but it has been going down that alley of more openness. But Xi reverted the policies of openness to an extent that China before 2013 and China now is just like not recognizable.
And Xi wants to scrap entirely liberal democracy.
I have a feeling he does want to, and I think that it is a difference. I mean, of course, China has, in the last 7 decades, has been an authoritarian communist country. But in the 80s, in the 90s, and even in the beginning of 2002 until 2010, everyone or a lot of people had the feeling, okay, it's opening up and maybe not, it's not fully becoming a fully democracy in a Western style, but somehow it makes China finds its way. Under Xi, this the opposite is happening. And to the question if China is a rival or a partner, I would say, of course, I mean, China is a big country with 1.3 billion people, and the economy is strong, and the rest of the world, of course, has to keep on talking, negotiating, and communicating with China. But on certain terms, human rights, what's happening in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and dealing with Taiwan, I think Xi Jinping, I would totally agree, Xi Jinping, the Xi regime, I would call it, is not a partner, is an enemy. And so I would say, okay, and if Xi is not willing to compromise on any terms, I would say the West, the Europe, and also Germany has to consider harder measurements.
What can the Europeans learn from the Americans on dealing with Beijing?
Oh, I think they have a lot to learn from the Americans. There's an extraordinary level of research and knowledge going on in the US into China that I simply don't see in Europe. I do see some in the Czech Republic.
Do we, the Europeans, underestimate the Chinese? Are we not taking them seriously? Because the Chinese often give signals that they feel misunderstood.
Oh, yeah, well, of course they would. I mean, it's very helpful to argue that one is misunderstood and therefore to gain sympathy, and that's, of course, what that's about, is that, you know, gaining sympathy, changing the atmosphere in democracies to support
Sounds very dismissive.
No, I think it's a fact. We can see how it happens through propaganda, through the shaping of arguments, the framing of arguments, through the establishment of systems of support for the Communist Party's political authoritarianism, even including here in Germany. Last year in my research, I uncovered a network of about 37 German organizations for China friendship, which, you know, per se is fine, wonderful, if it's independent, for example. But it's not, because, you know, it was actually set up in a very carefully structured way from Beijing. There was outreach from Beijing, shall we do this? And then one network connected to another. And if you go onto their website, there is only pro-Communist Party discussion and debate there. There is not another point of view. So it's a really effective propaganda influencing and interference system that is coming out of Beijing, targeted at the West. Why? Because liberal democracy is dangerous for a communist system. And a communist system cannot tolerate opposition because it's, well, by definition, it's a one party, so it can't tolerate opposition. So what's happening is that in order to make the world safe for China, if you like, for the Communist Party, it has to somehow control, manage or shape criticism, debate and discussion elsewhere in the world. It simply has to happen. Otherwise, it gets too dangerous at home for the party. And that's the point where the real friction starts, and that's the point where I think we've arrived at now.
OK, Alexander up next. We talked about the Americans. American President Donald Trump has for years taken a tougher approach on China than the Europeans. And as a result, Washington and China have been locked in a bitter and destabilising trade war. And there's a huge showdown over the globally successful social media platform TikTok. The US fears that parent company ByteDance is passing user details onto the Chinese authorities. Washington says China must sell off the US branch of its business or the app will be banned in the US. ByteDance denies all allegations. Alexander, what do you read into all that? What does that tell us about where we are?
I mean, it's obvious that and we spoke about this already, that like the Communist Party is like a vital part of each company operating in China. So there is no doubt about the fact that if you want to be successful as a company in China, you have to somehow be in an arrangement with the party.
It's absolutely monolithic.
So, I mean, I don't know how, breathing that engagement is, but literally when we talk about Huawei and 5G technology, it would be like insane to think that the Chinese government has no involvement in this. So it makes absolute sense on the end of the free world to just say, no, we don't want Huawei here. Mm-hmm. And Germany is still like in a position where it could go with its partners in the West, which just tries to meddle something. But I feel like, into your question and what you said, like in Germany compared to America, we are just very comfortable with ideas we deployed like decades ago. Like, for instance, China, as the claim, has never been an expansive power. So first of all, the people who say that are certainly no experts in Chinese history. But even if it were true in the whole past of the Chinese culture and states, it's not the case anymore. We see it's very expansive on many, many levels, not only the ones that you said. So what it needs to be done is then, of course, you have to rethink your strategy, your foreign policy. And that hasn't happened in the last years here, maybe because it's the last tenure of Chancellor Merkel, whereas Donald Trump explicitly ran on this platform of taking jobs back and whatever. That's a total different story, but it targeted China in a way that I feel in many capitals of Europe, politicians were actually envying in a sense that it's somebody in the end just finally has the courage to speak up.
I think that's true.
Felix, who's going to win this clash of systems? Who's going to win? That's perhaps not very... Who's going to prevail in the medium to long term?
Okay, that's a difficult question because depending, I think in the long term, I can say I do not believe that the Chinese system will win because the system itself has too many problems and people in China are maybe, you don't have surveys how comfortable they feel with the Communist Party. But I'm sure there are a lot of people who suffer under this system. And so democracy is of course a system what, of course, a lot of Chinese also want. So I think, definitely I would say in the long term, the problem is the timing. Nobody can tell how long this Communist Party or the Xi Jinping will still reign. But that's a difficult question.
Yeah, well, currently he wants to kind of rule forever. They fixed that up in 2018 when the law was changed to enable him to rule forever. He could be Secretary General of the party anyway, but the presidential term limits were taken away. I think that in Europe, there's this sort of rather unhealthy relationship that's built up with the United States now. And in some ways, I sort of understand it. There's been long dependency. There are different cultures, etc. But, so if people feel uncomfortable about looking to the United States because Donald Trump being toxic as he is at present, I think that's probably a fair comment in Europe, look to Australia. 26, how many people? 20, 23, 26, something like that, 20 plus million people. They are actually the leaders in many ways, and they in fact led the United States.
Interesting. Yeah.
They in fact led the United States in terms of research, action, analysis, pushback, beginning around 2010.
This has not been welcomed in China.
No, so they're having extreme problems now. But I think, Europe should absolutely look to Australia. There are lots of countries in Europe which are approximately the same size as Australia. Of course, the US is very big. It's a difficult ecosystem to somehow copy or replicate. Not possible, perhaps, in Europe. OK, look to Australia and see how they do things there and why they do things there, above all. That's, for Europe, would be a hugely important lesson.
So I once met the Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, and in the constitution of Taiwan, it's still written that the reunification with the mainland is a goal. And I said, Foreign Minister, how do you ever going to achieve that? And he looked at me and said, the moment when China becomes a democracy. So I feel that's what's most threatening to Xi is that in Taiwan and Hong Kong, there is a thriving democracy. Japan and Korea, that are democracies. So, and there's people opposing Xi Jinping also in the Communist Party, also people in the Deng family, like the Great Reformer or Open China Up. So, it's important for us now to strengthen those parts in China and not give up hope that there is actually a longing and a yearning for democracy.
So what's your banner headline now for where we are in relations between Germany, Europe and China?
Well, at this point, we literally have to see what's going to happen in 2023 when he wants to be elected again, so there will be an election. I don't see it coming, but that still is kind of a benchmark to see what's going to happen then, because if he's staying on forever, China will deploy into something that is Russia today or Turkey. Mm-hmm. It will also lose investors' confidence and whatnot. So that's going to be the decisive moment in 2023.
Felix?
Yeah, dealing with China, don't be afraid, but be cautious. That's what I would say.
Very good.
Very good, she says.
Yeah, very good advice. Cautious and try to see things, try to differentiate in the sense of moving away from this almost obsession with the People's Republic of China. I would say look to other parts of the world, look to Southeast Asia, look to further Eastern Asia.
Wise words, wonderful, thank you. The cosy times are over, said one German politician. I think he's right. We've been talking about China, partner or rival. Thanks very much for joining us, and do come back next time round. Bye-bye and tschüss.